So my name is Rosa, and I'm going to talk to you about what we talk about when we talk about saving species from extinction, and sort of the parts that are not talked about a lot. Normally in this room a lot, but normally and generally speaking, not so much. They were very hard to spot. They are very hard to find. And when you go through the bush, through the high grass, the biggest giveaway to see them are the big round ears. And once you see those, it's like, oh, that's where the African wild dog is. And this was told to me by Sam, and she's a nature guide in training. And she told me a lot about the marvelous ways of wild dogs and their social structures and how they tend to their pups and how they bring them out of the den after a denning period, and how they're sort of all chatting and they make this very nice sound, and it's a sort of, it almost sounds like birds, and it's like, it feels like they're talking and you want to be closer. But the first time I saw wild dogs was a little bit different, and not as I hoped. There were some hurdles to overtake to get there, because I was doing research in South Africa, in Hluhluwe-iMfolozi Park, but the provincial authority was a little bit hesitant of having this environmental historian there who would ask critical questions, so it was hard to get there. And to sort of fit in a little bit more, I bought like khaki clothes to camouflage myself within the conservationists and the rangers that I tried to interview. It was not actually practical for the bush, like it was not meant for that. And I wanted to interview people about all their dilemmas, etc., and how to live with wild dogs. So I interviewed Thomas, and Thomas is somebody who monitors wild dogs and follows the signal of the radio collars of some of the individuals in a pack. And he said after the interview, if you want to come along tomorrow with the volunteers, like, come along. And I was like, oh yes, please, I would love that. And the next morning we went out, and he brought me to this boma, and it's an enclosure, and that's where the first wild dog that I saw was leaning against the fence with a radio collar. And I was slightly disappointed, to be honest. I tried to not show it, but Thomas could sense it, and he was like, yes, I also wish you could see them like running and in the wild. So why was this wild dog in this boma, and how did it get there? So what you need to understand is that Hluhluwe-iMfolozi as a whole park is fenced. It's fenced off, and this comes from a time, it was established in 1895 as when KwaZulu-Natal was still a British colony. And the idea was to have mostly the game animals for the hunt inside and the people outside. So the Zulu-speaking people that lived there had to go, even though they have been there for so long. And so there's a lot of human orderings in this space, but the animals don't tend to sort of adhere to these human orderings. And the wild dogs are true escape artists. They go under, they go over, they go even through electric fences and electrocute themselves and then continue. And these wild dogs had escaped 3 times, and 3 strikes is out. So they would be translocated, and that's why they were in this boma. What they do outside is they want to disperse. They want to find, like, a couple of siblings are like, okay, we have enough of our family, we're going to go out and we're going to find some mates and try to see if we can start a new pack somewhere else. The other reason they would try to get out is because there's very easy and juicy, very slow moving prey in the form of cattle and goats outside behind the fence. And they tend to go out and kill goats and cows that belong to people. So imagine being on the other side of the fence, where you sort of wake up and you're confronted with sort of the effects and the devastation of wild dogs in the form of a sort of blood trail and dead goats laying around, because they sometimes tend to kill more than they eat. That's why they're also sometimes very hated. And that's the only interaction you have with wild dogs, because wild dogs move on very quickly. They move in big home ranges, and they're also sometimes called ghost dogs because you don't see them, but they are there. So the only interaction you have is with your lost livestock. And that's livestock that's supposed to be, for example, the goats pay for your children's goats, the goats pay for your children's school. And the cattle, it's like Nguni cattle, it's beautiful, beautiful animals. And they are very much a man's pride, like a Zulu man, like don't judge his cattle. And I've heard women say like, oh, a man would not even sort of sell his cow even if their children are starving. I need to convince him to do that. And this leads to a lot of conflict between the people outside the park and inside. And there's a lot of historical grievances. There's exclusion and colonialism, apartheid, a lot of big themes about land claims and compensation claims, etc. And what happens is that these animals that cross these boundaries are sort of the spark that starts this fire of conflict. And then there's like, gates are burned, fences are damaged. There's like a lot of, it's a very violent circumstances. And in comes Sandile. And Sandile is somebody I interviewed, and he is a very warm personality and a very reassuring voice. And that's definitely something he also needs in his work, because he is a conservation community officer. So he is the mediator for the park and the people outside. And he has to face the community when these things happen. And he told me when he speaks to farmers, they would sometimes say, the wild dog has never been here. They have been introduced by the white men. And in a way, that's true. Wild dogs have, in this area, been locally extinct for about 50 years. In the 1930s, they were seen as vermin and killed by the settler government, the British and the Dutch. And they were killed and they became locally extinct. In the 1980s, they have been reintroduced there. And in a way, sort of this animal not only disappeared from the environment, from the landscape, but also from memory, that people didn't realize anymore that they used to live with wild dogs and also had certain ways to deal with that and to protect their cattle, for example. And in this, Sandile always reminds people of, but there is this thing. We have this word, Nkanchane, and Nkanchane is something you would say to kids that eats very fast, and you want the kid to slow down. You say like Nkanchane. And Nkanchane is a word for wild dog. And he says, if they were never here, how come we have a word in isiZulu for this? Like, they were here, otherwise we would only have an English name. And this often helps a little bit. And I think what we sometimes forget when we're talking about extinction, that a species is also always its relationships to people. And one concept that very much relates to this is the extinction of experience. And that's the experience people have, the diminishing interactions. We all, like all of us in the global north and south, we have less interactions with nature in one form or another. And especially like the embodied interactions, not just sort of the BBC dynasties and David Attenborough, but also the real, actual bodily experiences. And these bodily experiences is very much what all the conservationists were talking about in the interviews. And for example, Kelly, she's also a wildlife monitor, and she follows the wild dogs. And one time they sort of couldn't find the dogs and the signal was not strong enough, and all of a sudden they found the wild dogs. And this wild dog growled at her, and she sort of felt it in her belly, and she was like, she felt seen in a way by the wild dog. And another story of Simon, and involved in the translocations of wild dogs. And he was telling me about this three-legged wild dog. The wild dog had lost one of her limbs, but she was still the alpha female, the best huntress, and he was talking about her so fondly. And I think that is something that Sandile is also dealing with when he's talking to community members. And he told me this story about when he was going to one of the communities, and there are 52 communities around the park. And he was telling me, I was very disturbed in one of these meetings. There was this old man, and he was talking to me, and he was like angry and swearing, and he was throwing all kinds of words of me. And he said, I'm used to that. That was not why I was disturbed. And he said, it wasn't necessarily that he was so angry at me, but he said, Sandile, I'm 95 years old today. I've lived next to the park, and I've never been inside. So what Sandile did was invite people on a drive through the park and show what was inside, what was happening all this time while they were neighbors. And he said, after that, I've never had an angry call again from this man. So what do we talk about when we talk about saving species from extinction? And when I was a child, I until a very embarrassing late age, whenever I saw a black and white film on television or historical footage, I thought the reality in the past was in black and white. And that at some point, color was invented, and the roses were painted red and everything got color. And I was like, oh, how lucky am I? I'm born after the invention of color. And I was just so pleased with that. Now, when I'm a little bit older, I also realize the world is losing colors. And that not only means literally in a way that, for example, the certain beetle species with very shiny, beautiful green, blue, metallic shells, they have now become extinct, and that color is not found anywhere else. Or, for example, the painted wolf, another name for wild dogs, they have very beautiful fur of, not to sound like Cruella de Vil, but very beautiful fur of orange and white and black, and every individual it has a different pattern. And we might lose that. But also, in a more figuratively speaking way, we're losing color. The world is losing color. When wild dogs would go extinct, it's not just sort of this hole in the world that is cut out in the form of a wild dog that we lose. We lose a species that has all kinds of relationships to the ecosystem. It's not just a biological entity or their genetics. They have all kinds of relationships. And also to people. It's a whole life world that would disappear. And it's the good and the bad is in there. We would lose all these sensations of wild dogs running over hills, in their packs, in their families, along riverbeds. And I think when we think about saving species from extinction and how to do that in a just way, we have to address a lot of issues around decolonizing conservation, especially in South Africa. There's so much going on: land claims, compensation, a lot of hurt and grievances. And one way to also find the way to the future is, I think, focusing on how can we rebuild these meaningful interactions with wild dogs. Thank you.